Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to take a look at a brief market update in the immediate aftermath of the tariff situation in the United States. Things may not be looking too bad for the next 90 days. So over the past 24 to 48 hours, we've seen essentially the administration in the United States coming out to say that they are pausing tariffs on most other nation states. In fact, everybody except for China. And we have seen the markets reacting and moving back to the upside as a result of all of that news in the past few days. So we're looking at the Bitcoin chart here. And when we're looking at what happened yesterday, we had this huge green candle. You can see that we had lows around 74.6. We went all the way up as high as about 83.5 before getting rejected from this medium-term trend line that actually goes back to the middle of January highs that we had for Bitcoin when we were up at that $109,000 level. So this is a very positive move to recapture some of the downwards price action we've seen over the past few weeks. However, as you can see, we're not fully out of the woods just yet, given that we're still getting rejected from the downtrend that we're currently in, okay? We did have this level marked in on the chart here at around 73.5, 73.6 as a major level of support, going all the way back to those initial highs that we ran up to in the middle of March last year. And you can see that in the past few days, we've also come right down very close, wicking down to retesting that particular level of support, okay? So what I'm looking at here is potentially for a decision to be made as we approach the end of April into May, and this aligns with some of the other key indicators that we're going to take a look at on today's video as well. But before we look at those, I did want to jump over and look at the S&P very quickly because, of course, the stock market has had a pretty rough few weeks, especially since those middle of February highs. We did come down plus 20% over a 44-day period. Okay, we had a big bounce yesterday. This daily candle for the S&P, again, a huge candle here on the back of that news that tariffs are being paused for the next 90 days. A 10% gain for the S&P across the board is a huge move in equities. And what we're seeing today is they're opening up a little bit lower and the market is kind of waiting to see which direction it's going to keep moving in. Okay, jumping back to Bitcoin, as we said, we still have not broken out of this downtrend. I would prefer to see us break out of this downtrend that we're still in before getting much more bullish. Okay, it could be possible that we still chop sideways here for a little bit more time before moving higher. But getting out of this downtrend, having a couple of daily candles closing above it would give me much better certainty that we have the ability to go higher from here. Okay, the other chart that I'm looking at, or the other indicator that I'm watching that syncs up pretty nicely with this 90-day tariff pause is the M2 Global Liquidity Index. Okay, if I bring this up on the chart here, you can see that we have global M2, which is essentially a measure of all of the cash reserves in all the major economies across the entire planet. And when we bring this up with a 105-day offset, what we're seeing is that Bitcoin typically follows M2 with about an 83% degree of accuracy. Okay, what that means is if we're looking at this offset on the chart here, there's a bit of debate as to which offset is actually the best. I do think this 105-day offset is statistically the most accurate, but just so you're aware, if you want to use this indicator yourself, you can search for M2 Global Liquidity Index, and it's this particular indicator by Christian Hutra that you can bring up on the chart here, which is represented by the yellow line on my chart. And what you'll notice is if we zoom out here, there's a pretty high degree of correlation between Bitcoin following M2 with that 8 to 12 week delay. Okay, again, this particular indicator allows us to change that time offset. Again, if we bring this back to zero, what this essentially means is you can see that M2 has actually been increasing since early January of this year. We had a retracement of M2 during Q4 of 2024, but because it takes Bitcoin 8 to 12 weeks to follow in the footsteps of M2, we didn't see that retracement reflected in Bitcoin until Q1 of this year. So what I'm thinking is, again, if we put in this 105-day offset, is that now that Bitcoin has followed M2 to the downside, we are approaching the bottom of this trend where we could be finding a rough bottom for Bitcoin in the coming weeks, and then moving back to the upside to follow M2 throughout the course of Q2. Okay, this is not guaranteed. Of course, make sure you always do your own research and look at the charts, consider the fundamentals and everything else when you're doing your own analyses. But if Bitcoin is to continue following M2 in a similar to fashion to what it has done over the past couple of years, you can see that we might be in for a little bit more chop, but essentially by the time we get here to around the 25th of April, that is technically the lows on this M2 chart with the 105-day offset, and Bitcoin could begin to follow it to the upside from that point onwards. Okay? Again, we got to remember it's not guaranteed, but now that we have the tariff situation on pause for the next 90 days, that means we may not face major headwinds in terms of narratives or in terms of market sentiment that are going to put up large challenges to equities and Bitcoin moving higher after this pullback. Again, equities pulling back since the middle of February, Bitcoin pulling back since the middle of January. You could argue we're due to get a little bit of a bounce, but given that we have a pause on those tariffs for 90 days, and that syncs up very nicely with essentially this, we can measure it in terms of days as well, this 90-day, exactly 90 days from the bottom of this to the top of this trend here with the 105-day offset, 90 days from April 25th, you can see that 90-day outlook with M2 increasing. And again, we've already seen M2 increasing since the middle of January. It's just that Bitcoin takes 8 to 12 weeks to follow it. So this has already happened. We're just waiting for Bitcoin to follow in its footsteps, and that measuring exactly 90 days and a 90-day pause on tariffs, I just think there could be some positive price action here in Q2 throughout the end of April into May and June, and we could see Bitcoin moving back up, potentially to retest those previous all-time highs around $109,000. Okay, so that's the general outlook I'm looking at over the course of Q2 here. Of course, we know if Bitcoin begins to make these moves to the upside, we are likely to see many alts first in line with Ethereum, Solana, maybe Sui, and a few of the other major alts beginning to follow in hot pursuit of Bitcoin moving to the upside. And again, we need to wait to see confirmation of some sort of altcoin season, but for the next 90 days, with a 90-day pause on tariffs, with global M2 moving to the upside for 90 days, that's already happened, and we're just waiting for Bitcoin to follow. I think it's a pretty nice setup as we move into the end of April, May, and June. Again, there's possibly some other unknown variables that we cannot account for here. There could be narratives, there could be news that interferes with some of this over the coming weeks and months. But as for now, I think it's a pretty positive setup for the next 2 to 3 months. And we want to position ourselves to benefit from that. And we are positioning ourselves to benefit from that with our portfolios, with the DeFi liquidity provision that we're doing. So drop any comments below this video if you want some strategic insights into what we're doing in the UIG. And you can get links to access all of that good content in the description below this video as well. So that's the outlook for the next 90 days, guys. I hope that makes sense. I think there is some positive sentiment on the horizon after a rough Q1. So stick in there, make sure to hold your bags, make sure to get some gains, and make sure to provide liquidity, generate cash flow. If you want to learn more about that, there is descriptions in the video below. Check them out, and we'll catch you in the next one.